Clearwater Valley, Montana Territory. October 1887. The air was already sharp with the promise of a punishing winter, and the cottonwoods along the river had surrendered their last yellow leaves. Every other settler was chinking walls, banking earth against their foundations, and splitting the last of their seasoned pine and fir. Every settler, that is, except Soren Lund. He was on his roof, building another roof. The absurdity of it stopped men on their way to the trading post. His existing cabin was a fine one, built of stout 12-inch lodgepole pine, expertly saddle-notched and sealed. It was as good a cabin as any in the valley. But now, rising above it, was a second ghostly framework. A skeleton roof pitched steeper than the first, held up by sturdy outriggers bolted to the main cabin's walls. Briscoe Tate, the master framer who had overseen the construction of half the buildings in the settlement, stood with his arms crossed, a look of profound disbelief on his face. "Lund," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the crisp air. "What in God's name are you doing? A man builds one roof to keep the weather out. You're building a second one to invite trouble in. The first heavy snow will collapse that thing right into your kitchen." Soren Lund, a quiet man of 40 years with the pale eyes of a North Sea mariner, paused his work. He looked down at Tate, then at the small crowd that had gathered. "It will hold the snow," he said, his Danish accent smoothing the edges of his words. He said nothing more, turning back to setting another rafter. Rufus Nye, the wagon maker, shook his head and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "He's mad. That's foreign nonsense. All that framing is just more surface to catch the wind. He's building himself a kite." The assessment rippled through the onlookers, followed by murmurs of agreement. The word that settled over Soren Lund's project that autumn was foolish. They called it Lund's Folly, or the glass trap, for the most insane part of the plan was not yet visible. The massive, expensive crates of window glass stacked carefully by his woodpile. What did this Danish shipwright, a man who understood the enclosed, sun-beaten spaces of a ship's deckhouse better than anyone, understand about solar radiation and trapped air that a valley full of experienced frontier builders had missed entirely? This channel is dedicated to rediscovering the lost wisdom of the frontier, the practical, often counterintuitive, solutions our ancestors devised to survive and thrive. If you believe that a good idea is more powerful than a loud opinion, hit that subscribe button. I promise that by the end of this story, you'll understand the profound physics behind Soren Lund's crazy glass roof. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories of quiet genius travel. Soren Lund was not a fool. He was a man shaped by salt water and unforgiving winds. Born in Skagen, the northernmost tip of Denmark where the Baltic and North Seas collided, he had spent 20 years of his life as a shipwright. He knew how to build structures that could withstand the worst nature could offer. He understood stress, load, and the critical importance of a perfect seal. But more than that, he understood sunlight. He had seen how a small glass pane in a captain's cabin could turn the small space into an oven on a bright, cold day at sea. He had felt the heat radiating from a sun-drenched deck long after the sun had set. He saw sunlight not just as light, but as a source of free, relentless power. He had come to Montana with his wife, Thyra, and their 2 young children, Axel and Freya, seeking land and a life away from the crowded ports of the Old World. Their first winter in the Clearwater Valley, spent in a hastily built, conventional cabin, had been a lesson in brutality. It was a cold that was not just an absence of heat, but an active, aggressive presence. It crept through the walls, poured down from the ceiling, and radiated up from the floor. They had burned through 8 cords of wood, an astonishing amount that left Soren exhausted from the constant labor of felling, splitting, and hauling. Thyra had spent the winter stuffing rags and moss into the endless gaps that opened in the green logs as they dried and shrank. The children, Axel and Freya, were perpetually bundled in wool, their faces chapped and their hands cold. The water bucket 6 feet from the roaring stove was often skinned with ice by morning. Soren, a methodical man, observed the failure of his shelter, not with frustration, but with an engineer's eye. He watched the way the fire consumed wood, how the heat rushed up the chimney, and how the single-pane window became a sheet of beautiful, deadly frost. A clear sign it was a gaping wound of heat loss. He laid his hand on the interior log walls and felt the chill of the -20 degrees Fahrenheit air just inches away. But the greatest heat loss, he knew, was straight up. Heat rises. The simple, universal truth of convection was his cabin's greatest enemy. His roof, despite being well built with sod and sheathing, was a massive, uninsulated surface bleeding warmth into the infinite cold of the Montana sky. He watched his neighbors suffer the same fate, their chimneys pluming smoke day and night in a desperate, inefficient battle against the cold. The problem wasn't their work ethic or the quality of their logs. The problem was the design itself. It was a design meant only to shed water and snow, not to manage heat. The standard frontier cabin was a marvel of simple, rugged construction. It was designed to be built quickly, with available materials, by men who were farmers and hunters, not thermal engineers. Briscoe Tate's own home was considered a masterpiece of the form. The logs were a uniform 14 inches. The dovetail notches were so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade between them, and the chinking was a perfect mixture of clay, sand, and grass that set like mortar. Yet, on a January morning with the temperature at -15 degrees Fahrenheit, the inside of Tate's cabin was a study in thermal gradients. Near the massive stone fireplace, it was a blistering 85 degrees Fahrenheit. 10 feet away, the temperature dropped to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Against the north wall, it was a mere 34 degrees Fahrenheit. His wife hung blankets to create smaller rooms within the room, trying to trap pockets of livable air. They burned a cord of wood every 12 days. The failure was systemic and rooted in a misunderstanding of heat transfer. First was conduction. The logs themselves, though seemingly thick, were poor insulators. A 12-inch pine log has an R value of about 15. A modern, standard insulated wall has an R value of 19 to 21. Heat slowly but surely wicked straight through the wood. Second was convection. Every tiny crack, every gap around the door frame or window sash became a high-velocity inlet for frigid air. This cold air, being denser, would sink to the floor, displacing the warmer air and pushing it upwards where it would escape through the ceiling or the chimney. This created a constant chilling draft at floor level, where the children played. Candles would flicker in a supposedly sealed room, their flames bent sideways by the unseen river of cold. Third was radiation. The human body loses heat to colder surfaces around it. Sitting near an uninsulated wall or a frosted window, a person would feel cold even if the air temperature was reasonable, because their own body heat was radiating away towards the cold surface. But the biggest culprit, as Soren had identified, was the roof. A simple plank and sod roof had an R value of less than 10. All the heat generated by the fire, dutifully rising, would hit this ceiling and conduct right through it into the sky. The frontier cabin wasn't a home, it was a sieve. It could only stay warm through the brute force application of constant, massive amounts of fuel. Soren Lund knew he couldn't win that battle. So he decided to change the rules of the fight. Soren began his project in late September. The first stage was the support structure. He felled 10 straight strong lodgepole pines, peeled them, and let them season for 2 weeks. He then bolted them vertically to the exterior walls of his cabin, 4 on each long side, extending 8 feet above his existing roofline. These were his primary uprights. To these, he affixed the outriggers, heavy beams that canted out and up, forming the base for the new, higher roof. Briscoe Tate watched this part of the construction with professional scorn. "He's compromising his walls?" Tate explained to anyone who would listen. "Those bolts will create a pathway for moisture right into his top logs. He'll have rot within 3 years. And the leverage on those uprights in a high wind? It's reckless." Soren ignored him. He was a shipwright. He knew how to fasten a mast to a deck. He used a technique of interlocking joinery, sealed with pine pitch, that made the connection stronger than the log itself. Next came the new roof frame. He built it with a steep 45-degree pitch, much steeper than his cabin's 30-degree pitch. Rufus Nye, the wagon maker, scoffed. "A pitch that steep is for a church, not a home. Wastes lumber and creates a huge, useless attic space." But Soren's reasoning was precise. The steeper angle would help shed the heavy, wet snows of late winter. More importantly, it was angled to catch the low arc of the winter sun, maximizing its exposure from sunrise to sunset. The most controversial phase began in mid-October when the freight wagon arrived from Missoula. On it were 4 large, heavy crates. When Soren opened the first one, revealing dozens of small 18 by 24-inch panes of glass, a hush fell over the small group of onlookers. Dorothea Kell, the pragmatic owner of the town's boarding house, did a quick calculation in her head. "Soren Lund," she said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "That looks to be near $70 in glass. You could have bought another milk cow and a year's worth of flour for that. What earthly good is a window on your roof?" "It is not a window," Soren replied calmly, carefully lifting a pane. "It is a collector." The mockery intensified. A glass roof in a territory known for hailstones, the size of eggs and snowfalls, measured in feet, not inches. It was the pinnacle of madness. The work was painstaking. Soren constructed a grid-like frame for the entire south-facing side of the new roof. Each small pane of glass was set in a bed of carefully mixed linseed oil putty, the same kind he would have used to seal a ship's porthole. He overlapped them like shingles, a technique that would encourage water to run off rather than pool. The north side of the new roof was not glass, but solid planking, double-layered for insulation. Between the original cabin roof and this new half-glass structure was a sealed air gap, measuring 30 inches at the peak and tapering to 18 at the eaves. He had built a box of air on top of his house. His wife, Thyra, watched with a mixture of apprehension and unwavering faith. "It looks like a crystal palace for squirrels, Soren," she said one evening. "I hope you know what you are doing." "It will be warm, Thyra," he promised. "The sun will heat our house." The science Soren Lund was deploying was what we now call passive solar design. The principle is elegantly simple and relies on the different wavelengths of solar energy. Sunlight arrives primarily as shortwave radiation. This shortwave energy passes easily through glass. When it strikes a surface inside the enclosed space, in this case, the dark sod and planking of Soren's original roof, it is absorbed and re-radiated as long-wave radiation, which we feel as heat. Glass is largely opaque to this long-wave radiation. It can't get back out. The heat is trapped. This is the familiar greenhouse effect. On a clear winter day, the sun delivers approximately 300 BTUs of energy per square foot per hour. Soren's glass roof had a surface area of nearly 300 square feet. This meant that, in theory, his collector could be harvesting up to 90,000 BTUs per hour, the equivalent of a small furnace running at full blast. This energy would heat the air trapped in the 30-inch gap between the two roofs. As this air warmed, it would do 2 critical things. First, it would dramatically reduce heat loss from the cabin below. The primary mode of heat loss through a ceiling is conduction. Heat from the living space, physically passing through the roof materials into the cold air. But now, the air directly above Soren's ceiling wasn't minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. On a sunny day, it could be 70 degrees Fahrenheit or even 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature differential was tiny, so conduction slowed to a crawl. He had created a massive sun-heated, insulating blanket. Second, he had a reservoir of warm air. Soren had built 2 vents into the system. One was a low intake vent from the cabin into the air gap, and another was a high outlet vent from the air gap back into the cabin. By opening these vents, he could create a natural convection loop. The cooler, denser air from the cabin floor would be drawn up into the superheated space between the roofs, get warmed by the sun, and then flow gently back into the living space through the high vent. He had built a solar-powered furnace that required no fuel, had no moving parts, and was utterly silent. The old shipwright had turned his entire roof into an engine powered by the sun. The first test came in November. A cold snap sent temperatures plunging to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. It was cold enough to form ice on the inside of his neighbor's windows, but the sun was bright. By 9 a.m., Soren laid his hand on the ceiling planks inside his cabin. They were warm to the touch, a slow, gentle current of warm air, smelling of sun-baked pine, drifted down from the high vent he had opened. The temperature inside his cabin rose from its overnight low of 58 degrees Fahrenheit to 68 degrees Fahrenheit by 11 a.m. He did not light the stove. Thyra worked at her sewing table in the middle of the room, not huddled by a fire. The children played on the floor without their coats on. The true crucible, however, began the week before Christmas. A storm system from the Arctic, what the old-timers called a blue norther, descended on the valley. For 10 straight days, the temperature never rose above zero. It bottomed out at minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, a new record for the territory. The wind was a constant physical force that stripped heat from every surface. The valley hunkered down for a siege. At Briscoe Tate's house, the battle was constant. They burned through wood at an alarming rate. The fire was never allowed to die down, requiring someone to be awake at all hours to feed it. The windows were opaque with a half-inch of interior frost. Despite the roaring fire, the corners of the cabin were dangerously cold, and the family lived in a small 10-foot circle around the hearth. One night, a water barrel kept inside, 10 feet from the fire, froze solid and split its staves. At Rufus Nye's, the situation was similar. He had 2 young sons, and his wife kept them bundled and close to the stove. They hung quilts over the door and windows, plunging the cabin into perpetual gloom to slow the drafts. The constant sound was the ring of an axe on frozen wood and the howl of the wind. Dorothea Kell's boarding house, the largest structure in town, was consuming wood like a locomotive. She had 2 big stoves running constantly, yet her boarders complained of the cold in their rooms. She was paying top dollar for extra cords of wood to be hauled in, watching her profits for the entire winter literally go up in smoke. Meanwhile, at the Lund cabin, a different routine unfolded. The first 2 days of the storm were overcast, and the solar effect was minimal. Soren used his stove as any other settler would, keeping a small, efficient fire going. His cabin, already better sealed than most, held the heat well. But on the 3rd day, the storm broke, and the sky turned a brilliant, painful blue. The sun, though low in the sky, was intensely bright, its light reflecting off the new snow. Outside, the temperature was minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the air gap of Soren's roof, a silent miracle was happening. The temperature began to climb. By 9:30 a.m., the air in the gap measured 65 degrees Fahrenheit. By 11 a.m., it was over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The dark surface of his original sod roof was soaking in the free energy. Inside the cabin, Soren had let the fire die down to coals after breakfast. He opened the convection vents. a steady, silent river of naturally warmed air began to flow into their living space. The temperature held at a comfortable 67 degrees Fahrenheit all day. He did not add a single log to the stove. While his neighbors were engaged in a desperate, shivering fight for survival, Soren Lund sat at his table, reading a book in the warm, quiet sunlight, pouring through his south-facing window. His children played. His wife baked bread, the heat from the cook stove only adding to the cabin's warmth. They did not light the main heating stove again until after the sun went down at 4:30 p.m. The next day was the same, and the day after that. He never lit his stove before noon. Word of this strange comfort began to spread, carried by the simple observation of Soren's chimney. On the coldest, clearest days, when every other chimney in the valley was belching a thick column of smoke, the Lund chimney let out only a lazy, thin wisp, if anything at all. It was an impossible sight. It defied everything the settlers knew about winter. The breaking point for Briscoe Tate came on the 8th day of the freeze. He was cold. He was bone-weary from splitting wood, and his pride was being chipped away by the quiet plume of smoke, or lack thereof, from Lund's folly. He put on his heaviest coat, pulled his hat down, and marched across the frozen snow to Soren's cabin. He was not going to ask for help. He was going to find the trick. He knocked, and Soren opened the door. Tate was hit by a wall of warmth. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of a wood stove at full blast, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that filled the entire space. There was no draft at his feet. He looked at the stove. It was dormant, with only a bed of glowing coals visible through the grate. The Lund children were in their shirt sleeves. Thyra was humming as she kneaded dough. It was an image of impossible domestic peace. "Lund," Tate said, his voice tight. "How?" Soren simply pointed up. "The sun." Tate's eyes narrowed. He was a man who believed in what he could touch and measure. "I don't believe it." "Get your ladder," Soren said. Tate fetched his own ladder, not wanting to borrow anything. He propped it against the interior wall and climbed. He reached the ceiling. He hesitated, then pressed his bare palm flat against the pine planks. He had done this in his own cabin 100 times, and the ceiling was always frigid, sometimes even coated with a thin layer of frost from condensed breath. Soren's ceiling was warm, not hot, but distinctly, undeniably warm, like a stone that had been left in the sun. The color drained from Briscoe Tate's face. He climbed down the ladder slowly, his movements stiff. He walked to the center of the room and stood there for a full minute, turning in a slow circle, feeling the evenness of the heat, seeing the placid calm of the family. He had built 27 cabins across 2 territories. He was the expert. He was the master framer. And he had been completely, fundamentally wrong. "You trapped the sun," Tate said, the words coming out as a quiet revelation. "Like a beaver dam traps water. You hold it." "Yes," Soren said, "you hold it." That moment was the turning point. Briscoe Tate, the loudest critic, became Soren Lund's most fervent advocate. He began to explain the principle to others, using his own authority as a builder to give it weight. "He's not warming his house," Tate would explain over and over. "He stopped it from getting cold in the first place. He's put a winter coat on his roof." Rufus Nye came next, then others. They would enter Soren's cabin, feel the warmth, see the sleeping stove, and leave shaking their heads in wonder. Soren, for his part, was gracious. He never once said, "I told you so." When they asked him how he built it, he shared his plans freely, explaining the importance of the seal, the angle of the glass, and the function of the vents. That spring, a revolution in frontier architecture began in the Clearwater Valley. Few could afford a full glass roof like Soren's. The $70 cost was simply too high. but they could afford the principle. Briscoe Tate was the first to adapt it. On the south side of his own cabin, he built what he called a sun porch, a long, narrow room with a glass-paned roof and walls. It wasn't connected to the house with convection vents, but it acted as a massive thermal buffer. The south wall of his cabin, previously a source of constant cold, was now adjacent to a room that could reach 80 degrees Fahrenheit on a sunny day. His wood consumption dropped by 30% the following winter. Rufus Nye, the wagon maker, built smaller sun boxes over his two south-facing windows. They were simple three-sided glass boxes, about a foot deep, sealed against the house wall. They trapped the solar energy, pre-warming the air next to the glass and drastically reducing the heat loss from the windows. The cost was less than $5 in glass and lumber. By the spring of 1889, 12 families in the valley had incorporated some version of Soren's sun trap design. The idea spread to neighboring settlements, carried by word of mouth. It became known as the Lund Roof, or the Clearwater Conservatory. A writer for the Helena Daily Independent wrote a small piece about the Danish shipwright who heats his home with winter sunshine, and the territorial extension agent, Pearl Tackett, made a special trip to document the design, which was later included in a pamphlet on efficient frontier construction. That's how real wisdom spreads on the frontier, not through patents or academic papers, but through a neighbor seeing what works, swallowing his pride and asking, "Can you show me how?" Soren Lund's invention was a century ahead of its time. He had, with the practical knowledge of a craftsman, stumbled upon the core principles of modern passive solar architecture. His sun trap roof was, in essence, an early form of an isolated gain system. The sun porch adaptations were rudimentary trombe walls or thermal buffer zones. The sun boxes were a precursor to high-performance triple-pane windows, which used the same principle of a sealed, insulating air gap. Modern architectural simulations confirm the viability of his design. A study by the Department of Energy on passive solar retrofits in cold climates showed that an attached sun space, like the one Briscoe Tate built, can reduce a home's heating load by 20 to 40%, remarkably close to the 30% Tate anecdotally reported. Soren's more integrated system likely achieved savings of over 50%. This wasn't primitive guesswork. It was sophisticated environmental engineering, born of necessity and observation. There is a profound lesson in the story of Soren Lund's glass roof. The community saw the world through the lens of their own expertise. To a framer, the problem of winter was a structural one: thicker walls, tighter joints. To a wagon maker, it was a material one: glass is fragile, wood is strong. They were all trying to solve the problem of keeping the cold out. Soren Lund, the outsider, the man from a different world, reframed the question entirely. He saw the problem as one of keeping the warmth in, and he recognized that the most powerful source of warmth was already there, shining down for free every clear day. His genius was not in inventing a new technology, but in seeing a resource where everyone else saw only a liability. He didn't fight the winter sun's low angle. He angled his roof to welcome it. He didn't curse the cold. He used its contrast with the sun to create a powerful thermal engine. It's a timeless reminder that sometimes the greatest innovations come from those who look at a familiar landscape and see something no one else has noticed. It's a testament to the quiet power of observation, the humility to learn from failure, and the courage to build something that everyone else thinks is crazy. Thank you for joining us on this journey back in time. If these stories of ingenuity and resilience resonate with you, please consider subscribing and liking this video. It helps us reach more people with these forgotten histories. For our next story, we'll be looking at a Kentucky mountain settler whose bizarre fireplace design baffled his neighbors until it proved to burn 40% less wood while producing more heat. You won't want to miss it. Disclaimer: The story presented in this video is a fictionalized historical reconstruction, inspired by real principles of frontier innovation and passive solar design. The characters, names, and specific events are created for narrative purposes. The technical principles discussed are based on established physics and historical building practices. This content is for educational and storytelling purposes only and does not constitute professional architectural or engineering advice. Any application of these principles should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and regulations.